They say the Vatican is the smallest country on earth. But what if I told you it might be one of the richest? Behind the marble columns and stained glass windows lies a fortune so vast, and so well protected, that no outsider has ever truly seen its full scope. For decades, journalists, economists, and even governments have tried to trace it. Some have found fragments, pieces of a puzzle scattered across centuries. But the complete picture? That remains locked away, deep inside the most secretive city in the world. Today, we're going to follow the trail. From ancient land grants and royal donations, to secret vaults, offshore accounts, and global property empires. We'll step into the shadows of history and see just how far the Vatican's wealth may reach. Our investigation begins over 1,600 years ago. Rome is collapsing, yet Christianity is rising in influence. The Church owns little more than land for worship, but every year its reach grows. With every new ruler converted, the coffers grow heavier. By the Middle Ages, kings and queens are no longer just sending prayers to Rome, they're sending gold, land, and entire towns. These gifts are rarely just acts of devotion. Each one buys something: papal favor, political support, or spiritual legitimacy. And with every transaction, the Vatican's influence spreads. The Papal States emerge, a vast territory across central Italy. Here, the Pope rules not just as a spiritual leader, but as a head of state. Taxes, agriculture, trade routes, all flow into the Church's treasury. By now, wealth is not just measured in coin. Gold chalices, jeweled relics, priceless manuscripts, treasures arrive from across the Christian world. Some are displayed proudly, others vanish into the depths of the Vatican's private vaults. Those vaults are more than just storage rooms. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in a labyrinth of stone and shadow, lie chambers almost no one outside the Vatican has entered. Some contain relics of saints. Others, financial ledgers written centuries ago. Rumors speak of gold from fallen kingdoms, bonds signed by monarchs, and artworks never shown to the public. Is this careful preservation or deliberate secrecy? Fast forward to the modern age. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, is created to manage the Church's global finances. Billions in assets pass through it, shielded by the Vatican's sovereign immunity. But in the 1980s, the illusion cracks. The Banco Ambrosiano scandal explodes, a web of money laundering, missing billions, and political intrigue. A banker found hanging under London's Blackfriars Bridge. Allegations of mafia connections. Official investigations are launched, but the full truth is never made public. And even today, whispers remain. Certain accounts untouchable, transactions untraceable. Yet the Vatican's wealth is not confined to banks. It owns one of the most valuable art collections in the world, over 70,000 works. But here's the secret: only a fraction is on display. In climate-controlled vaults, behind locked doors, rest masterpieces worth hundreds of millions each. Paintings by Renaissance masters, sculptures from antiquity, manuscripts illuminated in gold. Why keep so much hidden? Is it preservation or power? Beyond the museums, the Vatican's portfolio stretches across the globe. Luxury apartments in London. Historic buildings in Paris. Farmland in rural Europe. Investments in stocks, bonds, even technology companies. Many of these are held through layers of private firms, making the true scale of the Church's wealth nearly impossible to track. During wars and economic crises, the Vatican has quietly moved assets across borders, sometimes in gold, sometimes in foreign currency. Historians still debate whether Nazi gold passed through Vatican channels during World War II. The archives remain closed. Today, official reports give carefully selected figures, but never the whole picture. Estimates range from billions to hundreds of billions. And yet, for all the speculation, one fact remains: the Vatican guards its financial secrets as fiercely as it guards its spiritual ones. Is this secrecy a shield against political interference? Or is it the greatest financial cover-up in history? The Vatican's true fortune may never be known. But in a city where every stone holds a story, and every shadow hides a secret, one thing is certain. The closer you get to the truth, the harder it becomes to tell where faith ends, and fortune begins.
In the heart of Rome, where cobblestone streets wind toward a city within a city, stands the smallest sovereign state in the world, yet one of the richest. Behind its ancient stone walls lies not only spiritual authority, but also a fortune shrouded in secrecy. The Vatican has been called many things: a holy sanctuary, a political player, God's bank. But to understand how this tiny enclave came to possess such vast wealth, we must step back. Not a few decades, but centuries. Back to a time when faith and fortune began to intertwine in ways that would shape the course of history. It began humbly enough. The first followers of Christ were fishermen, laborers, wanderers. They preached, they suffered persecution, and they owned little more than the robes on their backs. But faith spreads in mysterious ways. By the 4th century under Emperor Constantine, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And with that single decision, the church was no longer a small movement on the fringes. It became an institution. Power attracts resources, and resources, once gathered, invite more power. From the very beginning, the church received gifts: gold from rulers seeking divine favor, land grants from noble families hoping to buy eternal salvation, and offerings from the faithful who gave as much as they could. Then came the Middle Ages, and the Vatican's rise accelerated. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader, he was a political force. The church owned farmland across Europe, collected tithes from peasants, and imposed taxes on kings. The faithful were told that salvation could be aided through financial offerings, a belief that would eventually lead to the infamous sale of indulgences. But the church's wealth did not just come from generosity or devotion. Some of it came through conquest. During the Crusades, armies marched under the banner of the cross, seizing treasures from the Holy Land and beyond. Gold, jewels, and relics made their way back to Rome, swelling the church's coffers. In those centuries, the Vatican's reach was unmatched. Land was the currency of power, and the church became one of the largest landowners in all of Europe. Monasteries, cathedrals, and vast estates stretched from the British Isles to the edges of the Mediterranean. And wherever the church had land, it had income, from crops, from rents, from trade. Yet the Vatican's wealth was never purely about accumulation. It was about symbolism. Magnificent basilicas, adorned with marble and gold, sent a message. The church was eternal, powerful, and divinely blessed. To enter St. Peter's Basilica was to stand in awe of an institution that could summon the greatest artists, architects, and craftsmen of its time. Still, beneath the soaring ceilings and stained glass, there were whispers that faith and fortune were becoming dangerously intertwined, that the wealth meant to glorify God was also securing the political dominance of men. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the Vatican was no longer just a religious capital. It was a financial empire. It minted its own currency, ran its own courts, and commanded armies. Every pope was both a shepherd of souls and a ruler of a vast economic machine. And yet, this was only the beginning, because the methods by which the Vatican would expand, protect, and conceal its fortune were about to grow far more complex and far more controversial. The Vatican's rise as a power wasn't simply the result of faith, it was the result of strategy, a kind of political craftsmanship refined over centuries, where theology met diplomacy and morality walked hand in hand with money. By the medieval period, the Pope stood as more than a spiritual guide. He was a kingmaker, a man whose blessing could legitimize a monarch's reign and whose condemnation could shatter it. In an age where religion was not a choice but the foundation of law, culture, and identity, to fall out of favor with Rome was to risk political death. A single decree of excommunication could strip a ruler of his authority overnight. Peasants would refuse to obey him. Nobles would turn their allegiance elsewhere. In the eyes of the people, a king cut off from the church was a king cut off from God. And so, kings paid, not always openly, but always heavily, for Rome's approval. Some sent ships laden with gold and silver. Others offered land, castles, or armies for the church's causes. In return, the Vatican gave legitimacy, influence, and occasionally, silence. The papacy had mastered the art of leverage. It mediated peace treaties, sanctioned wars, and acted as an arbiter in disputes between rival kingdoms. In each of these roles, the Vatican took its due, not always in coin, but in favors, political concessions, and valuable promises that could be called upon years later. Yet its power wasn't limited to diplomacy and politics. The Vatican was a landowner on a scale rivaling entire nations. Vast estates stretched across Europe, fertile farmlands in France, vineyards in Italy, pastures in Spain, and sprawling monastic lands in Germany and England. The people who lived and worked on these lands often never saw Rome, yet their labor fed it. Their taxes and rents climbed the economic ladder until they reached the papal coffers. And then there were the indulgences. Originally, they were intended as acts of devotion, a way for the faithful to show repentance and receive spiritual grace. In their earliest form, indulgences might require acts of charity, pilgrimages, or the construction of churches. But over time, that spiritual currency was replaced with something more tangible: gold. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences had become a booming trade. Priests and traveling agents crisscrossed Europe, carrying papal authority to sell forgiveness. People would sell their livestock, their land, even their homes to purchase what they believed was a guaranteed path to heaven. To the faithful, it was hope. To the Vatican, it was an ocean of revenue. And to its critics, it was nothing less than the commodification of salvation. These critics grew louder over the centuries. Men like Jan Hus and Martin Luther, who accused the church of trading in fear and turning piety into profit. Pamphlets were written, sermons denounced the practice, but the machine was too well built, too deeply embedded in the church's operations to stop. Through every controversy, the Vatican adapted. It defended its practices, rebranded them, and in some cases, quietly evolved them into subtler forms. And the wealth kept flowing, not in sudden windfalls, but in steady, reliable streams from every corner of Christendom. Gold from monarchs, taxes from peasants, fees from merchants, and indulgences from the faithful. This wasn't fortune by accident. This was fortune by design, an economic system wrapped in divine authority. By the eve of the Renaissance, the Vatican was no longer simply the heart of Catholicism. It had become something far greater, a multinational power whose influence could cross borders without armies and whose wealth could move in silence, unnoticed by most of the world, yet felt in every kingdom that sought Rome's favor. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Vatican was no stranger to wealth. Centuries of land ownership, donations, and influence had built a formidable economic base. But the world was changing. Industrialization, global capitalism, and the rise of nation-states demanded new financial strategies. The church needed to evolve or risk being left behind. In 1929, an event reshaped the Vatican's future forever: the signing of the Lateran Treaty. This historic agreement between the Holy See and Benito Mussolini's fascist government finally resolved the Roman question, the decades-long dispute over the Pope's temporal power after the Italian unification had dissolved the Papal States. On the surface, it was a political resolution, but beneath lay a staggering financial transaction. Italy agreed to pay the Vatican 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in Italian government bonds, an amount equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. This compensation for lost territories became the Vatican's seed capital to enter the modern financial world. With this new wealth, the Vatican began transforming its ancient treasure into a sophisticated investment portfolio. The church no longer depended solely on tithes or land rents. Instead, it became a silent player in international banking, real estate, and industry. But to manage this, it needed a proper institution. In 1942, the Vatican established the Institute for Works of Religion, the now infamous Vatican Bank. Ostensibly created to serve charitable and religious activities, it quickly became the financial heart of the Holy See. What made this bank unique was its sovereignty. It operated outside Italian law, immune to taxation, and shrouded in secrecy. This independence was a double-edged sword. During World War II, Europe was engulfed in chaos. Nations fell, borders shifted, and vast amounts of wealth changed hands, often under dark circumstances. Historians and investigators have long debated the Vatican Bank's role during this period. Allegations surfaced that it acted as a conduit for transferring wealth, including gold and valuables looted by the Nazis from occupied countries, Jewish victims, and even governments in turmoil. While the Vatican has steadfastly denied any wrongdoing, insisting it only protected legitimate assets, the truth remains partially obscured by sealed archives and code-name transactions. Whispers of Nazi gold passing through Vatican channels have fueled decades of controversy, casting a shadow over the Church's financial reputation. After the war, rather than diminish, the Vatican's fortune grew. It diversified its investments, acquiring stocks, bonds, and real estate worldwide. By the 1950s and 60s, it was quietly building a sprawling financial empire, reaching far beyond Italy into global markets. Yet the Vatican's wealth was never flaunted. Unlike the ostentatious splendor of St. Peter's Basilica, much of this fortune was hidden in shell companies and anonymous accounts. The Church's economic power became an invisible force, quietly shaping industries and influencing politics. However, such immense power and secrecy invited risks. Over the coming decades, the Vatican Bank would be linked to scandals involving money laundering, mafia ties, and financial mismanagement. Topics that rocked the Church and exposed the dangers of combining spiritual authority with unchecked economic might. But through it all, the Vatican maintained a steady course. Its financial empire, a vital tool to protect the Church's independence, fund its missions, and maintain its global influence in an increasingly complex world. They say money is power, but when money meets the divine, it becomes something else entirely. Influence on a scale that shapes nations, cultures, and even the course of history itself. By the late Middle Ages, the Vatican had perfected an economic machine that blurred the line between faith and finance. And at the heart of it was a single lucrative idea: salvation had a price. Pilgrims poured in from across Europe, bringing offerings in exchange for blessings, relics, and indulgences, certificates that promised a shorter time in purgatory. For the devout, these were not just pieces of paper, they were tickets to eternal peace. For the Vatican, they were a gold mine. But the Church's coffers didn't just grow from pilgrims. Medieval Europe was a deeply religious society, and people were encouraged to will their lands, estates, and fortunes to the Church as acts of piety. When wealthy nobles died without heirs, the Vatican often became the legal inheritor of vast properties, vineyards, and entire towns. Over centuries, this turned the Church into one of the largest landowners in Europe. And then there were the taxes. Yes, even the faithful paid their dues. Known as Peter's Pence, this was an annual collection taken from Christians across the continent, supposedly for the support of the Pope and the administration of the Church. In reality, much of it went into financing wars, political alliances, and ambitious architectural projects. But perhaps the most fascinating and controversial part of this era was the Church's role as a banker. At a time when Christians were forbidden to lend money at interest, a practice considered sinful, the Vatican found creative ways around this. They worked through trusted banking families, most famously the Medicis, who handled investments, loans, and financial schemes on behalf of the papacy. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the Vatican was no longer just a spiritual authority, it was a financial empire. And its wealth was not just stored in gold or silver, it was invested in influence. Kings came to the Pope for loans. Princes sought the Vatican's blessing before waging war. And merchants, whether they liked it or not, often found themselves paying dues to the Church through elaborate trade levies. But there's another layer to this story, one that speaks to the Vatican's unmatched strategic vision. While European kingdoms rose and fell in bloody succession wars, the Vatican's wealth was protected by something no other power could claim. It was considered sacred. To attack church property wasn't just a political crime, it was a sin. And in the deeply religious world of the Middle Ages, that was enough to keep its fortune safe for centuries. Yet this growing economic power didn't go unnoticed. Reformers and critics began to question whether the Church had strayed too far from its spiritual mission. Whispers turned into accusations, and those accusations would one day fuel one of the greatest religious upheavals in history, the Protestant Reformation. But before that storm arrived, the Vatican's golden age of wealth accumulation was far from over. Behind the marble walls and candlelit chambers, the machinery of power continued to hum, quietly reshaping the world in ways both visible and hidden. By the mid-20th century, the Vatican found itself in a new kind of battlefield. Not one fought with swords or muskets, but with banknotes, investment portfolios, and the rising tide of global capitalism. The Second World War had redrawn the map of power, and the Church needed to adapt fast, or risk losing centuries of influence. This was the era when Vatican finances became truly modern, and the creation of the Institute for Works of Religion, better known as the Vatican Bank, would forever change how the Holy See managed its money. On paper, the bank's mission was noble: to safeguard church funds, support its global missions, and provide financial services to Catholic institutions. But behind closed doors, this little-known bank was no ordinary financial institution. It operated outside the rules of conventional banking: no taxes, minimal transparency, and diplomatic immunity. It was in many ways a bank that could move money anywhere in the world without the usual questions. Donations from the faithful, profits from Vatican-owned real estate, royalties from religious publications, and even lucrative stock investments flowed through its discreet channels. And because of its sovereignty, no foreign government could simply barge in and demand to see the books. This secrecy was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it allowed the Vatican to protect its financial independence from meddling governments and political regimes. On the other hand, it opened the door to allegations, some true, some exaggerated, of shady dealings. Stories began to emerge of the Vatican Bank being linked, directly or indirectly, to money laundering schemes, offshore holdings, and even Cold War espionage funding. One of the most controversial episodes came in the 1970s and 80s, when the bank's connections to Banco Ambrosiano, a private Italian bank, ended in one of the biggest banking scandals in modern European history. Millions vanished, high-profile bankers turned up dead under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled that organized crime and political operatives had used Vatican channels to move money beyond the reach of the law. The Holy See has always insisted its financial dealings were lawful and moral, and to be fair, much of its wealth did go toward charity, hospitals, schools, and humanitarian projects. But the fact remained: the Vatican now controlled one of the most unique, untouchable financial systems on earth. A system born from centuries of land, gold, art, and political deals, now reborn in the age of offshore accounts and global finance. It was no longer just about preserving the Church's spiritual mission. It was about ensuring it had the economic muscle to survive and influence in a rapidly changing world. As the Vatican's financial empire continues to evolve, its story reminds us that power, whether spiritual or economic, carries immense responsibility. Behind the grandeur and mystery lies a complex web of influence that shapes more than just faith. It shapes history itself. In the end, the Church's wealth is not just about gold or investments. It's about survival, legacy, and the enduring pursuit of authority in a changing world. What remains hidden in the shadows may one day come to light, but for now, the Vatican's secret fortune continues to be one of history's most enigmatic legacies. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of Money and Mayhem. If you found this story eye-opening, don't just stop here. There are more untold stories waiting for you. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss an episode, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're ready for another deep dive into the shadows of power, click on the next video on your screen now. Until next time, remember, every fortune has a story, and every story has a secret.